Hello, my name is Chris Pence, and I am a board conservationist with the Board of Water and Soil Resources out of the Brainerd office. I work in 6 counties, Cass, Crow Wing, Aiken, Morrison, Todd, and Wadena, and also in 6 major watersheds. I work in the Leech Lake River, the Pine River, Mississippi River Grand Rapids, Mississippi River Brainerd, which we'll be talking about today, the Long Prairie River, and the Crow Wing River. My role is to assist local government units in developing and implementing comprehensive watershed management plans through the One Watershed, One Plan program. Today I'm going to be talking about the transition from the work that has been done on the Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy, or the RAPS report, and how that transitions into the One Watershed program with Bowser. I'll talk a little bit about the history of water planning to frame how we've moved from county-based plans to watershed-based plans. I'll talk a little bit about how some of the legislative actions that have been taken to get us to this point, and then I will cover the One Watershed, One Plan program itself, and then get to the important part, which is fund availability to implement projects. I can tell you that times have changed a lot in the last couple months with the COVID-19 virus. It would be my preference to give this presentation in person, but that is not an option. I am actually recording this presentation here from my home office, and this type of presentation, I've done them in the past. It tends to generate lots of thoughts and questions. So feel free to contact your local government staff for more information, or reach out to me. My contact information is on the last slide. You can reach out to me through email or phone call. Feel free to ask those questions. It's much more. I'd prefer to do this in person and get those questions right away, but we'll use what we have now at our disposal, and let me know if you have any questions. The One Watershed, One Plan is a statewide program where the goal is to develop prioritized, targeted, measurable implementation plans that align with state strategies on major watershed boundaries. And we'll really kind of tear this or break this program vision statement down a little bit. What we're really going to focus on are the prioritized, targeted, and measurable. We'll talk a little bit about how they're aligned with state strategies, and then the major watershed boundaries. In the long run, we believe this program will result in better water management, enhanced partnerships between local government units, more consistent funding, and the ability for local governments and the state to demonstrate progress towards clean water. So the question, I've heard from people, is the watershed concept new? We're just starting to really get involved in this in the last few years from a planning concept. And the important to think about is that planning from a watershed perspective has been around for a while. Any idea, just a quick question, this is a federal document that came from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, now with through like NRCS and FSA, those groups with the federal government. This was produced in the 1940s. So the idea of working in watersheds is not a new concept by any stretch, but it is now being implemented on a statewide basis, and it brings its opportunities and challenges. So One Watershed, One Plan program built on a long history of the establishment of local government organizations that specialize in soil and water conservation and water management. Each was created with a special purpose that was associated with the values around natural resources and how people use them. Soil and Water Conservation Districts, or SWCDs, were established primarily to help individual landowners care for their land. Watershed districts were established primarily to address upstream and downstream problems that were associated with flooding. Then in the 70s, the federal and state Clean Water Acts were put in place to address water pollution problems, and primarily that was point source, where you could actually visibly or noticeably see where the actual pollution was occurring from. So, if you look at this timeline, you can see that, we started with conservation law back in the late 30s with the first SWCD being formed. The Watershed Act started in 55 with the first watershed district being created in 1957. But as you go along this timeline, what's important to look at is 1987. That was when counties were given the opportunity to develop individual water plans based on the individual issues based in counties, and that was a big deal. And there was some funds at that point to implement dollars or to implement projects based on what those plans were. And these plans were always voluntary, but most counties adopted those county water plans. What was important, if you see on this timeline, was 2008. A huge shift in the paradigm for how we manage water was changed in 2008 when we as Minnesotans agreed to basically increase the sales tax to provide funds for to improve clean water and to protect and restore that, and then to also focus on habitat and to improve local habitat for wildlife. And then also there was some funds from that were designated for parks and recreation along with the arts. And what this really allowed us to do was to really have an opportunity to collect more data so that we could have more information about water monitoring and testing and what was actually happening within our watersheds, more state funding for implementation, and a focus on accountability. Watershed plans are the key link between data, implementation, and streamlining that process on a watershed scale. It's really important, I think, to know that Minnesota is pretty unique in this legacy amendment. Not a lot of other states have the access to the literally millions of dollars that we have now to focus on how we can improve and our natural resources in the state. Just real quick too, just to hit on 2010, I'll talk about this in a little bit more in a second, but the local government roundtable got together and decided they wanted to talk about how water planning was happening in the state and if there were ways to improve that. You look at 2015, that was when we really started getting into development of these comprehensive watershed management plans through the One Watershed, One Plan program. Funding started coming along in 2017 to fund the first pilots. And then in 2017 and beyond, more and more watersheds are getting into the program to go through that planning phase, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So in 2013, well, actually in 2010, the local government water roundtable, which consisted of the counties, the Soil and Water Conservation District, and the watershed districts got together and said, we really want to talk a little bit about how we're doing our water planning and how should we look at this from more of a watershed basis. The three main recommendations that came out of this were to plan on a major watershed scale, to streamline the planning process, and then provide predictable funding based on the plans that were developed. To provide a little bit of background, in the early days of 2010, the legislature asked Bowser how many plans were out there for water management, and Bowser replied that there were over 200 water management plans, which included county plans, SWCD plans, watershed district plans, and metro plans. Needless to say, the legislature felt that was way too many plans for not enough work getting done. The State Association, or the Minnesota Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts, represented the SWCDs. The Minnesota Association of Watershed Districts represented the watershed districts, and the Association of Minnesota Counties represented the counties. They all saw the writing on the wall and decided to act before the legislature did. And that was what they said. They asked, basically said, give us a year and we will come back with a proposed solution. And that was where that local roundtable was born, where representatives from all the organizations came together to really come up with the idea of a single watershed-based approach that would cover all of the local governments within that watershed. Basically, the starting point of the One Watershed, One Plan program. So a lot of times, there are some new local officials maybe who weren't around when this was in place. A lot of times people think that this was a state-driven program, and it really came from local government units. So when they ask you where that came from, we can say it came from the local governments. It was their idea to move to this watershed-based strategy. So One Watershed, One Plan is the name of the program at Bowser which supports the development of the comprehensive watershed management plan. The program provides funding, support, and guidance for the program in the form of staffing and written documents and policies. which the legislature directed Bowser to adopt. If you look in statute 103B.101, permits Bowser to adopt policies that allow plans to substitute for one another or to adopt a comprehensive watershed management plan. And 103B.81 defines the purpose and requirements for comprehensive watershed management plans and directed Bowser to develop operation procedures for plan development. A lot of times when people look at or hear about the One Watershed One Plan, they think they're actually developing, they call it a One Watershed One Plan, and really what you're developing is a comprehensive watershed management plan. The program is the One Watershed One Plan program, and that is what is used for local government units to partner together to come in and request funds to begin the planning process. And what this does is it replaces water plans for a county into a watershed area. And again, as mentioned before, it is voluntary and not required. But if you choose to not plan or develop a plan for that watershed, it does not. That means there won't be any funds available then to implement projects within that watershed from the Clean Water Fund. So when you're looking at water management in Minnesota, we look at the different levels of watersheds. And from a technical standpoint, these are called hydrologic unit codes. What you see before you here is a map of the major basins and watersheds of Minnesota. And these are referred to as a hydrologic unit code 4. So the area to the north and are the Red River, the North Basin, and the Rainy River Basin, and those actually drain north up towards Canada. If you look at the Great Lakes Basin, which is over by Lake Superior and Duluth area, the North Shore, that actually heads east and heads out towards the Atlantic Ocean. The remaining part of this is the Upper Mississippi and the Lower Mississippi Basin and the Minnesota River Basin, which end up draining down to the Gulf of Mexico. If you look on the map that you see, you'll see the a major watershed, which is the hydrologic unit code 8. That's what all these are. There's 81 of them in the state, and what we're focusing on today is the watershed with the number 10. That's the Upper Mississippi Brainerd watershed. And so what we did at Bowser was some of these watersheds are a little bit smaller than others, and so we tried to put together some planning area watersheds, and so there's 60 of these planning regions within the state, and that's what we're looking to plan on through the One Watershed One Plan program. What's interesting, as I mentioned before, is that all the watersheds in Minnesota exit the state. We don't receive water from other states. We're kind of the headwaters of 3 major watershed basins. And so we have a responsibility for keeping our water clean for our downstream partners. When the One Watershed One Plan program was established, the legislature directed Bowser to create a transition plan laying out how we get statewide coverage with this program by 2025. What you'll see here is a map of the watersheds, the planning watershed boundaries that we've established, and the areas that are in green have an approved plan. And so right now you'll see a group of those on there. There were 5 watershed pilots that started back in 2015. They've been approved and received funding to implement their plans. We have 18 more that are working on their plans right now, and so we're getting real close. We're right about, if you look at the plans that have been approved and those that are in the planning process, we are right at about halfway towards our goal of having all the watersheds with a plan by 2025. Recent watersheds with approved plans include the Pine River, the Leech Lake River, Thief River, and Lake of the Woods. In the next couple months, we'll be accepting more proposals for planning grants and expect to have another 6 or 7 enter the program. Like I said, that means we'll be right on track to meet our legislative goal of having the watersheds through the process by 2025. So if you look at the Mississippi River Brainerd Watershed, who are the local partners, there are 5 counties in the Mississippi River Brainerd Watershed. These counties are Aiken, Crow Wing, Morrison, and Todd, and these each have 10% or more of the watershed landmass, and they are required partners to be part of the planning process. Cass County has less than 1% and are an optional partner, so they wouldn't really be required to get involved, but they would definitely be allowed to participate if that's what they chose to do. Data, data, data. We have more data now than we could ever have imagined possible. I remember when I first got into resource management, one of the things we were always looking for and wished we had was just more data. This is a good and a bad problem to have. It is good to have data as it informs the decisions that we make, but sometimes we have too much data, and that it is hard to makes it more difficult to prioritize and to plan when we have to decide what we're going to do with all that information. So a lot of the information that we have that plays into the One Watershed, One Plan, the real big one is that watershed restoration and protection strategy that was worked on by the Pollution Control Agency. So the things that on this that you see would come from that report would be the assessment report, the stressor ID report, the TMDLs, strategy tables. So that's a big part of the data that we use when developing these plans. A lot of it comes from local citizens and elected officials and those folks with local knowledge and information about the resource. Nobody knows a watershed better than the folks who live in it. And so that's a big part of the process. Research and studies that are out there, some modeling that can give us some ideas of what of what might occur with certain things would happen in the landscape as far as land disturbance, agricultural uses, those sorts of things. The comprehensive watershed management plans developed through the One Watershed One program must incorporate and prioritize, target, and measure during that planning process. And that's a real important thing, is prioritize, target, and measure. One interesting piece of data that I wanted to mention is the connection between protected land and clean water. A landscape stewardship plan, or an LSP, is a big picture review of forest management in a major watershed. LSPs are a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service, the Minnesota DNR, our agency Bowser, the Soil and Water Conservation District, and counties, working with private landowners to voluntarily manage their woodlands. The DNR did a study about 10 years ago that said that if we can keep 75% of a watershed in protected status, you're going to have clean water for the future. We do know that protection efforts are much more cost effective and simpler to implement compared to restoration and trying to have to restore and in essence fix some of our water quality problems. 25% is the tipping point for an increased phosphorus load in the watershed, and phosphorus is that limiting nutrient which creates the algae and weed growth, or the vegetation growth in our lakes, that are problematic for recreational fishing and swimming uses. I encourage you to watch a presentation from my colleague Dan Stewart, who is doing another one of these presentations, to learn more about that study and state programs that are available to assist in achieving that 75% goal, and what can be done within the Mississippi Brainerd Watershed to achieve that 75% goal. So kind of the question is, how do we actually do that? So what does it actually look like? Landscape stewardship plans through local technical staff prioritize the most important areas of the watershed to work in, targeting parcels using a RAQ methodology, RAQ, to select the best parcels for the taxpayer dollar, and then to measure back to our goals, are moving that needle to 75%. RAQ, or RAQ, stands for riparian, which is another word for just parcels that are adjacent to lakes, streams. Is the parcel adjacent to existing public land, and that could be public land that is under the management of county, state, federal, tribal, counties, townships, that land which is in public ownership that is available for public use and recreation. And then quality. The Q is kind of the wild card that is really determined at a local level. What is it about the resource that we're targeting that makes it valuable or high quality? A lot of those, some of those types of quality could be things like wild rice, a Cisco or Tulubi lake, which is a forage species for some of our larger predator fish like muskie, northern pike, walleye. Other things could be biodiversity? Are there unique species of plants or wildlife that are in that resource? So that is really determined at a local level. And what we do is once we score these parcels for ones that are adjacent to water, are they adjacent to existing public land, and then that quality, they get scored out. And it's really a screening tool that allows us to target, to prioritize, where do we want to work in the watershed, what's the most important area, and then how do we target those key parcels for conservation. I think it's important to remember that what we're trying to do is get a return on our investment for the taxpayer dollars that are invested in these conservation needs, and then measure how do we move that needle to protection to show that we're actually accomplishing something, that people will be able to notice a difference within the quality of lakes within their watershed. And so what that landscape stewardship plan does is it helps to prioritize, target, and measure for forest stewardship practices within these watersheds. The stewardship plan that you see here is actually for the Mississippi River Grand Rapids, which is a watershed to the north of this. But as we speak, funds are being utilized to develop a plan for the Mississippi Brainerd watershed, and that should be developed around 2021. Again, we go back to the three words I mentioned before: prioritize, target, and measure. And this is the opportunity where I would drop a hint that if you were to walk away with one thing from my presentation today, I'd hope that you would remember these three terms: to prioritize, target, and measure, because those are the guiding principles as we develop these watershed plans. And so we're really prioritizing what is the most important area of that watershed to work in. And then we're targeting where in that watershed, what are the key parcels that we want to focus on that will help us reach our goals of clean water within that watershed. And then how do we measure what we've done? Can we show that we've increased the amount of protected acres within a watershed? Have we reduced phosphorus loading into a lake because of how we manage our stormwater from stormwater runoff from rain events and snowmelt? Have we been able to increase vegetation along our lake shores to provide a filter before some of that runoff goes into the lake? So prioritize, target, and measure. That is really the key to what we're trying to accomplish as we go through this planning process. We have gotten pretty good at applying models and tools so that we can write a far more detailed and technical plan and make good use of the increase in monitoring data and models as we develop these plans. The concept behind the One Watershed One Plan program is to establish shared goals for managing the watershed. These goals are developed and owned by the local governments and ideally align with or have the support of actions taken by state and federal governments and other partners. So the three key partners that are actually set at the table to develop and approve these plans are counties, soil and water conservation districts, and watershed districts. The state, the public, the federal government, other partners like non-government organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Land, and others provide input. But at the end of the day, the final decision makers on these plans are the counties and the SWCDs. And in those areas that have watershed districts, they also are part of the decision-making process. This slide shows the various groups that are formed to move through the process of developing a One Watershed One Plan in each watershed. When you see the titles across the top tell you what the titles of the teams are. The bullets in blue show who are in those teams as far as local government groups and that, and then the green kind of explains what their roles are and what their tasks are. So the steering team is really made up of staff, the LGU staff, and then a consultant if hired to help with the process, and then Bowser is typically part of that with a board conservationist or a clean water specialist. And really what the steering team does is they're responsible for logistical organization, just making sure that the train is running on time. They're the ones that are organizing the meetings, getting agendas set up. They're pulling together the information, just really making sure that things are logistically happening. They're part of the team that handles the reporting and to making sure that the funds are being allocated properly and so that's the steering team's role. The policy committee, they are the elected officials, and so the policy committee is made up of one member of each local government unit. One elected member represents their local governments on these committees. So one member from each county, one elected member from each soil and water conservation district, and then one from a watershed district if that is applicable. So their job is to represent their local governments through this process. They review recommendations of the advisory committee, and then they're the ones that make final decisions about plan content and that. The advisory committee is made up of government staff. There's some requirements of who has to be on that based on BWSR policy, and that is state agencies such as the DNR, Department of Health, MPCA, Department of Ag, BWSR. We're all part of that. And then the policy committee can appoint other folks to that, other stakeholder groups that they want to be part of that advisory committee. And their job is to review and provide feedback to the policy committee. They're really the ones that work closely with the consultant and local government staff to help draft the plan. And then the policy committee is the one who reviews that and then goes down the task of developing the final plan and going through the approval process. There's some phases and commitments as you get into this. What you see above the line are the phases, and the planning phases, and below the line are the corresponding commitments. So at the beginning, the first two, the kind of that purple and blue, you're kind of scoping and pre-planning. Basically what you're looking for at this point is a resolution of support from the local government units within the watershed, signaling their intent that they want to be part of the planning process. Then they would get into signing a memorandum of agreement that says, hey, this is how we're going to work together to do this. There's many types of agreements that can be used to do this. You can go from a joint powers collaboration where you just agree to work together on a collaboration, but you haven't created an entity like a joint powers board. That's another option. And so that is all figured out before you really get into the planning process of the One Watershed, One Plan program. But once you get accepted into the program and you have received grant funds, at that point then you're into plan development, review, adoption, and really at that point what it is, it's just time and effort. It usually takes a couple years to go through this process. Some watersheds have been able to get through in a little bit over a year. Some watersheds have taken over 2 years to get there. So it all depends on the relationships within that watershed, within the local government units, and how they're interacting with their stakeholders and citizens to get input in that. Once you have the plan developed, then it's implementation, and that's the part where funds are dispersed out to the watershed and to the partnership, and then the partnership decides how they're going to implement those funds through work plans, and BWSR's and BWSR's involved in all these steps. So we are happy to be part of the scoping and the pre-planning to help walk through the process of what this takes. And then BWSR is definitely involved in the plan development, reviewing the adoption, making sure that all the statutory requirements are met and all the policy is adopted by the BWSR board are followed through on the document, and then being there for implementation to assist in work plan development and getting that approved so that funds can be sent out to implement the projects as described in the plan. And so how this work is accomplished and might look different from where it is now compared to a watershed approach. What this slide shows is how it was before a One Watershed plan in blue, and the new when you're looking at it from a watershed management perspective. Keep in mind that money that gets spent in the county does stay in the county. And that's an important piece to remember. Projects are often done by local contractors, which means local jobs. So on the left side, you currently have an LGU of counties working in their own individual counties on planning, regulation, enforcement, land use, drainage, enforcing WACA. You have the SWCDs getting cost share to implement projects. So you're getting county funding to do this. You're getting block grants from the state that are funneled through BWSR. You're maybe getting some federal funding to implement these. From a watershed partnership standpoint, you begin to look at things like, can we share staff? Are there shared programs that we should be working on together instead of doing things on our individually? What about big projects? Are there things that are happening upstream in the watershed in one county that's having a detrimental impact downstream at a county in a different part of the watershed? Can we pool our resources? Are there other grant funds available out there? Those sorts of things are the opportunities, I think, that come from working together in a watershed partnership. These are the actual funds that were allocated by the Bowser Board this year. Previous grant funding for county water planning was a competitive process, and many good projects were not funded simply due to limited funds. And it's not that the projects weren't good, but I've always said that all the project proposals that we get are good, better, and best. And typically the projects that get funded are the best ones. And there's just not enough money to fund all those projects. What we're doing through the One Watershed, One Plan program is we're transitioning to a non-competitive funding based on a formula, which means that all plans will be funded to a point, and local officials can then plan and rely on that stable funding. As always, there's always a caveat that says that funding is subject to legislative appropriation every 2 years, but right now the plan is for these plans to be a 10-year plan, to have 10 years worth of funding, and that would be 5 2-year grant cycles, fiscal grant cycles. So in September of 2019, the Bowser Board allocated $13,600,000 for the first year, and $13,375,000 the second year of fiscal year 2021 for watershed-based implementation funds. This is money dedicated towards implementing the comprehensive watershed management plans. Again, there's no guarantee about funding into the future, but it is expected that the funds will continue for the next 10 years. The funding formula for all these watersheds are that the watersheds all will receive a flat $250,000 minimum with inflators for the amount of private land and miles of shoreline that include rivers, streams, and lakes and wetlands within that watershed. This list here includes watersheds that have approved plans or are in the process of almost being approved. You'll see on this list that Mississippi Brainerd isn't on the list here because it hasn't been approved for a plan yet, obviously, because you haven't been in the planning process. But what I encourage you to do is just look at some watersheds that might be similar in size, maybe location. So take, for example, Leech Lake River. They were recently approved for a plan, and they're going to be were just recently allocated $600,000. The Pine River, which is to the west of that, was approved for just under $500,000. And now it's important, I want to remind you, this is not a one-time allocation. This is a 2-year allocation. So once in 2 years, another allocation of these funds will come. And so, if you're looking at, say, the Leech Lake River, if you look at that, you're looking at almost $3 million available to spend on projects in this watershed over the next 10 years, which is significant, and will definitely move the needle towards clean water within these watersheds. This slide here is just a slide that shows some of the watersheds that were actually in the planning process when the Bowser Board approved the allocation back in September. And so if they are able to get their plan approved this year, these are the funds that would be available to them. And I think it's just really important to look. Mississippi River Headwaters, $861,000. The Red Eye River over in the Wadena Ottertail area, $706,000. The Rum River, $1 million. So this is some very serious dollars, and I think it's important to know that putting in the effort to a good plan will then give you what you need to effectively implement these clean water fund dollars. But then there are assurance measures, from a statewide perspective, and as we're spending these taxpayer dollars, we want to make sure that funds are being spent properly. And so these are the 4 key assurance measures that watershed partnerships will be following and that will be using to ensure that the funds are being spent properly. These measures are based upon fiscal integrity and accountability for achieving measurable progress towards water quality elements of your watershed management or the comprehensive watershed management plan. Assurance measures will be used as a means to help grantees meaningfully assess, track, and describe use of these grant funds to achieve clean water goals through prioritized, targeted, and measurable implementation. The following assurance measures are supplemental to existing reporting and ongoing grant monitoring efforts. They don't replace those. So again, as I mentioned before, we're going to make sure that the projects that are being implemented are prioritized, targeted, and measurable, and are making progress towards achieving clean water goals. That these projects, these programs and projects and practices are being implemented in the priority areas, that your grant work is on schedule and on budget, and finally, I think an important one to bring up is just the leverage of non-state funds. Frankly, with the way these plans are coming out, there's not enough Clean Water Fund dollars to completely have the money to completely implement the plans with using just clean water funds, and so there will be a need of non-state funds to supplement these watershed management plan implementation. It's important to remember that the One Watershed, One Plan program is voluntary. There's no requirement to develop or adopt a comprehensive watershed management plan. It's just like county water planning, but it's just important to remember that if you don't adopt a watershed management plan, you don't have access to these clean water funds to implement these projects that are important in the watersheds. All counties have developed and implemented water plans, and we expect that they will also implement these comprehensive watershed management plans as well. So I know this is a change of going from county water planning to watershed planning, and there's a concern about potentially losing control locally. And the response that I have to that is that if you want to maintain that local control, I think it's really done most effectively through the comprehensive watershed management plans, and I think using the clean water funds from state dollars, it takes the pressure off local governments to have to use a lot of their money to implement these clean water projects. I'd like to just say thanks for taking the time to watch my presentation today. I hope it was helpful. Feel free to, again, reach out to your local government staff if you have any questions. Feel free to contact myself. My information is here on this slide, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have or thoughts. We're always looking for ways to improve the program and looking for things that we can do to make the One Watershed, One Plan program be more effective and to help us develop these better comprehensive management plans. Again, feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thanks.